used to be really uncomfortable with how often it seemed like my best friend talked about death. We'd be catching up over the phone and he'd say something like, "Oh, Joe, I'm really excited about this event I'm going to. It's an open mic called You're Going to Die." I imagine that he could sense me rolling my eyes at him even over the phone. I'd retort, "You know that sounds like the title of a horror movie, right?" He'd laugh and say, "Yeah, it does, doesn't it? But it's this organization out here in California that creates community spaces to talk about death and dying through arts, music, and poetry." I would shudder. "How uplifting," I responded. "Okay, why would you want to spend a whole evening talking about something so sad?" "Well, death may be sad," my bestie would respond, "but it's inevitable. Better to face it and make meaning about it than to ignore it." This friend's name is Zoe Toby, the musician who sang End the Song that we just heard as the offertory. Zoe wrote it when we were in college after he had what seemed to me like a relatively minor illness. And I'm pretty sure that 20-year-old me made fun of him for being morbid and melodramatic. Suffice it to say, my perspective has shifted since then. In fact, I have lyrics from that song tattooed. It has been Unitarian Universalist services that are among the things that have helped take death out of the shadows for me. It was hearing one simple Mary Oliver poem in a sermon that began to open the door, to shed some light on how we could name the realities of death. In her poem called In Blackwater Woods, Mary Oliver of blessed memory wrote, "To live in this world, you must be able to do three things: to love what is mortal, to hold it against your bones, knowing your own life depends on it, and when the time comes to let it go, to let it go." These are frank realities and deep truths about life and loss, love, holding each other closely, and letting go. As Rose shared so beautifully in her reflection, our mainstream American society doesn't really normalize talking about death, be it considering our own, talking with those who are nearing the end of their lives, or with those who are grieving. For me, it took going to seminary and doing a summer of hospital chaplaincy for me to start getting comfortable talking about death. But this, again, is another area in which our spiritual and religious communities can help us practice being countercultural. So let's go there. How do we talk about death? About mortality? About grief? These are big questions, so let's focus specifically on how we can be supportive of loved ones who are nearing the end of their lives, or be supportive of people who are grieving a loss. I'm not an expert on this, although there are experts out there, including in our own congregation. But I will say that each person is an expert on their own experience. The person grieving knows best what helps them. The person near death is the leading authority on their own thoughts, feelings, and needs. So before we get into talking about step one in talking about death, step 0 is following the lead of the person most impacted. But here are some practical steps for us to take when talking with someone, either who's nearing the end of life or someone who's in mourning. Step 1, show up. Before we even have a conversation, we need to be willing to show up for the person, willing to have a conversation. So many of us carry regrets from times where we put off seeing someone who was nearing the end of their life, whether out of worry that we wouldn't know the right thing to say, or maybe out of a quiet fear that it would be too hard or too sad. Same goes for reaching out to someone who's lost a loved one. Don't miss it. Your presence, your presence, if the person is up for company or conversation, means so much more than whatever words you say. And if they're not up for an actual visit, or there's someone who tends to cope with tough stuff through solitude, you could send a text or an email that expresses love and concern, including the line, "No response necessary. Just wanted to tell you I'm thinking of you." And don't underestimate the power of a heartfelt card. Whenever I send one, I wonder if it actually does anything. But I asked a friend who'd recently lost a family member what had been supportive. And he said without hesitation, the cards that people sent were super meaningful. I had no responsibility to respond or engage in conversation if I wasn't up for it. It let me know that people were thinking of me, but it didn't impose anything upon me. So step one, show up, make the phone call, send the text asking if they're up for a visit, send the card. Step two, acknowledge what's happened or what's happening. It's hard when it feels like people are tiptoeing around an obvious thing. We might be worried that mentioning someone's prognosis with an illness or bringing up someone's loss when they're grieving will make them sad. What I hear over and over again is, trust me, we're already sad and we're already thinking about it. It's okay to just name it. It can be as simple as, I'm so sad about what's happening and I just wanted to come tell you how much I care about you. You've been such a good friend to me. Or, I was so sorry to hear about your uncle's death and I've been thinking about you. Author Mindy Dykes wrote in her book called Beyond I'm Sorry, Supporting a Family Facing Cancer, that someone had said, quote, I heard that your son has cancer and that really, really sucks. Dykes reports appreciating the sentiment and described it as plain, simple, and on point. It doesn't have to be fancy. Step three, ask what's on their mind and heart. It's okay to invite your dying loved one or friend who's grieving to tell you how they're feeling. The invitation could sound something like, I want to know how you're really feeling, if that's ever something you want to talk about. It could open the door to them taking leadership in a conversation about the disease or about dying or about loss if they want to. Back to step zero, following their lead. You know, sometimes when people have visitors, that's just not what they want to talk about. And that's okay too. I really like the question, what's on your mind? Or what's on your heart? Or what's been coming up for you in all this? If you're up for really hearing and holding how they're doing, it can be incredibly supportive for someone dealing with loss to have the space to share when they want to. Hospice nurse Angela Morrow writes, many people are surprised to find that what a dying person wants to talk about is what's happening to them. In fact, many dying people are thinking the same thing, that talking about what's happening to them will only upset a friend or a loved one. Talking about death allows a loved one to express unspoken fears and concerns. Oftentimes, Morrow concludes, sharing these feelings with someone who listens fully and without distress can help reduce pent-up anxieties. Asking what's on your mind also gives the grace for them to name something totally unrelated to the loss, if that's where they're at. Sometimes people just need to talk about everyday things to give their hearts a break. And that's okay. Step 4, talk about life. In addition to hearing expressions of concern and caring, it can be really sweet to hear a positive memory. For instance, I don't know if you even remember this, but that time you had us over for dinner and we stayed up late playing games has always been special to me. I can still remember ... Or if you're talking with someone who's grieving a loved one, something like, even though I never met your dad, I remember that story you told me about when you spilled powdered sugar all over the back seat of his very clean car. I think of him every time I spill something in the car, which happened the other day. That one might be a real life example. Our grieving loved ones and our loved ones who are dying often do find it meaningful to hear these memories and know people are thinking of them. And also, I will say there's a balance between sharing memories and talking about our own feelings and remembering to center the experience of the person most impacted. This is Angela Morrow again, who writes, "Let compassion guide the conversation, remembering this is not about you. This doesn't mean that you can't share your feelings, just be sure those feelings don't add to a loved one's burdens, like whether or not you'll be able to cope once they die." And step 5 is simply let silence be okay. Let tears be okay. Beloved, death may be sad, but it's inevitable. Better to face it and make meaning about it together than to ignore it. Let's take death out of the shadows. When our loved ones are nearing the end or they've lost someone dear, let's follow their lead. Show up. Acknowledge what's happening. Ask what's on their heart. Talk about life. And let silence and tears be okay. We know grief likes to pull up a chair and make itself at home. Let's pull up a chair too. So may it be.